And what I've consistently seen in that time is what we typically see in Buteyko courses. For people who do the course for respiratory conditions like asthma, over 90% of people come off all of their reliever medications within a week of starting, even people who've been long-term Ventolin nebuliser users. And in the last probably 2 to 3 years, we've seen a significant increase in the number of people doing the Buteyko course for snoring and sleep apnea. And we've been able to help numerous people avoid having operations for obstructive sleep apnea and also avoid going on CPAP machines for sleep apnea. And for people who are already on CPAP machines, there's a very good chance you'll be able to withdraw from the machine once you've corrected your breathing with Buteyko. But we can't just throw the machine away. What we have to do is improve you to a certain extent and then have periods of observed sleep without the machine, noting the reduction in the frequency and duration of the apneas, and then increase that time as things continue to improve. And what I'll do is I'll explain a bit later on the theory of the Buteyko method and how it does apply to sleep apnea. And for those of you who are interested, I've also got copies of an article that was in the Australian Nursing Journal about the application of Buteyko to sleep apnea, which has got, well, that's where this diagram actually comes from, and it's also got some case studies in there. And that article was written by Mary Birch. Mary's a registered nurse who trained with me as a Buteyko practitioner about 6 years ago. So yeah, that's how I got involved with it all and a bit of what's happened over the last few years. Well, let's talk about what happens when we breathe and how we can get these improvements by altering our breathing pattern. Well, that's the composition of the air that we breathe. It's mainly nitrogen. About 78% of the air is nitrogen. Nitrogen is fairly inert, which means it doesn't react with a lot of things. 21% of the air is oxygen. As you probably know, oxygen is the gas that we need for the growth and regeneration of all our body cells and tissues. But the gas I really want to talk about is CO2 or carbon dioxide. Hardly present in the air at all, in fact only 0.03%. But in our lungs, or more specifically in our alveoli, the tiny little air sacs at the end of our lungs, we must have somewhere between 3 and 6.5% carbon dioxide. If the carbon dioxide level is low, it has a very negative impact on our health. Whereas the higher the level of carbon dioxide in the lungs, the better it is for our health. And the main reason for that is because of the way that the gas oxygen gets transported around in the blood. You may have heard of haemoglobin, symbolises Hb, the protein molecule in the red blood cells. Oxygen gets bonded to the haemoglobin and the whole molecule is called oxyhemoglobin. And you've literally got millions of these oxyhemoglobin molecules attached to your red blood cells. Now, it's great having oxygen stuck in your blood, but what you need to happen, of course, is to break the bond and get the oxygen released so it goes to your brain and goes to all the cells and tissues of your body. The key to breaking the bond and releasing the oxygen is to get your carbon dioxide level up towards the high end of the range. Well, let's think about that. If there's hardly any carbon dioxide in the air, but we've got more in our lungs, and that tells us that we produce it internally. And you're probably aware of that because you hear people say, oh yes, we breathe in oxygen, we breathe out carbon dioxide. It's a waste gas. We breathe out some of it, but we don't breathe out all of it. And we have to leave at least 3% in our lungs to stay alive, and the more we retain, the better. So if we want to retain a higher amount, and we're producing it internally, then we don't want to lose it. And the way that we lose it is by blowing it off by breathing too deeply. Either breathing through our mouth or breathing too deeply through our nose. So if we can retrain ourselves to breathe back at the normal level, we'll retain more carbon dioxide in the lungs, and that results in a much greater release of oxygen to our cells and tissues. This relationship between the CO2 in the lungs and the oxygen release from the blood is what's known as the Bohr effect. Some of you might know the name Bohr from scientific circles. Niels Bohr was a very famous atomic physicist. This is his father, Christian Bohr, Danish professor of physiology, who was nominated for the Nobel Prize in 1907 for his work in discovering this effect. So this is not new. It's been known for nearly a century. But what is new, what Buteyko has worked out, is that you can change the way that you breathe. You can reset the level of carbon dioxide, which triggers the breathing mechanism in your brain. So what does all this mean? Well, if I try to take away all of this scientific jargon and just to give it to you in very plain, simple words, what I'm really trying to say to you is that in order to get more oxygen, what you need to do is to breathe less. I'm getting some blank looks around the room. That sounds crazy, doesn't it? Breathe less and get more oxygen. Well, let me explain it to you another way. How many of you people have ever yourself hyperventilated or seen someone hyperventilate, where someone is breathing heavily and deeply for a prolonged period. How do you start to feel if you do that? What sort of symptoms do you get? Yeah, you get dizzy, you get lightheaded, you get anxious, you get agitated. And if you don't stop and you keep on hyperventilating, you'll get very tired. You'll start to lose the feeling in your fingers and toes, and eventually you'll collapse, you'll faint. So the reason we go dizzy, of course, is because we're getting a lack of oxygen to our brain. So the reason we use this example is to make us think, does deep breathing give us more oxygen? The answer is no, it actually gives us less. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard of the very old-fashioned but quite effective remedy for people who are hyperventilating to stop them going dizzy and fainting. Who can tell me what it is? Yeah, rebreathe your own air from a brown paper bag or similar device. And the reason it works, of course, is because of the Bohr effect. Because the air that you're hyperventilating out has got all this carbon dioxide, and if you can take some of it back in, the level rises again in the lungs and the oxygen gets released from your blood and goes to your brain and other cells and tissues and stops you going dizzy and fainting. So when we explain it like that, it makes a little bit more sense. But when you first say, breathe less and get more oxygen, it does sound strange, but that is actually the case. Now sure, if you keep breathing deeply and heavily through your mouth, you're taking in large amounts of air, large amounts of oxygen, but you're not getting the correct transfer, air to lungs, lungs to blood, blood to cells and tissues of your body. The key to getting that transfer happening is to breathe at the rate appropriate for your activity. And at the moment you people are at rest, your activity is minimal, and that is all the air that your body requires, 4 to 5 litres per minute. But we're not against deep breathing per se, we're just saying breathing should be relative to your activity. So the time to breathe more deeply, me standing up here speaking and moving around, you walking outside to your car, doing some physical exercise, going for a run, going for a swim, riding a bike, if you're dancing, if you're singing, all these sorts of things. But at rest, that's all the breathing that your body requires. And technically anything above that is over-breathing or hyperventilation.